The day my own son signed the papers to send me away, I realized I had already lost my place in his life long before I ever lost my home. I remember how quiet the car ride was that morning, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any argument. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, both hands gripping the steering wheel like he was doing something difficult, something necessary. Rebecca sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, her expression calm, almost bored, as if this were just another errand on her list. I sat in the back, my small suitcase beside me, packed with only what they told me I'd need for a short stay. That was the phrase they used. A short stay. Just until I felt better. Just until things settled down. I nodded when they explained it to me the night before, sitting at my own kitchen table, the same table where I had once helped Daniel with his homework, where I had hosted every Thanksgiving dinner for over 30 years. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply folded my hands and said, if that's what you think is best. Because somewhere deep down, I already knew this wasn't about what was best for me. The building came into view slowly, a wide brick structure with neatly trimmed bushes and a sign out front that read, Willow Creek Senior Living. It looked pleasant enough. Clean. Quiet. Forgettable. The kind of place designed to make you disappear without anyone feeling too guilty about it. Daniel parked the car and turned to me with a tight smile. It's just temporary, Mom, he said, his voice softer than usual, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Rebecca didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. I opened the car door myself, stepping out into the cool morning air, holding onto my purse a little tighter than necessary. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something sweet, like artificial vanilla. A woman at the front desk greeted us with a practiced smile, her tone warm but distant, as if she had said the same words 1,000 times before. Papers were placed in front of me. Forms. Agreements. Words blurred together into something official and final. Daniel pointed to where I needed to sign. Just here, Mommy, said gently. I looked down at the line, my name already printed neatly above it. For a moment, my hand hesitated. Not because I didn't understand what I was signing, but because I did. This wasn't a short stay. This was an ending. I picked up the pen anyway. I signed. The ink dried almost instantly. Just like that, it was done. My room was on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway lined with identical doors. Inside, there was a small bed, a dresser, a chair by the window. No family photos. No memories. Just space. Rebecca stood near the door, glancing at her watch. We should get going, she said. Daniel stepped closer to me, giving me a brief hug that felt more like a formality than comfort. We'll visit soon, he promised. I nodded, offering a small smile. Of course you will. They left together, their footsteps fading down the hallway, their voices blending into the background noise of the building. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence settle around me. Then I walked over to the window and looked out at the parking lot. Their car pulled away without hesitation. No second glance. No pause. Nothing. And that's when it hit me, not like a wave, but like a quiet, undeniable truth. This hadn't started today. It hadn't started with the car ride, or the paperwork, or the room. It had started long ago, in small moments I chose to ignore, in conversations that grew shorter, in visits that became less frequent, in decisions made without me. This was just the final step. I placed my hand against the cool glass of the window and exhaled slowly. They thought they had placed me somewhere safe, somewhere contained, somewhere I would simply fade into the background of my own life. But standing there, in that small, unfamiliar room, I felt something else entirely. Not fear, not even sadness. Something quieter, something sharper. Awareness. Because if they believed I no longer mattered, if they believed they had already taken everything from me, then they had made a mistake. And mistakes, I've learned, have a way of revealing far more than people ever intend. I woke up the next morning to a sound I did not recognize at first, a soft chime followed by a voice over an intercom announcing breakfast in the dining hall. For a moment, I lay still, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, trying to remember where I was. Then it came back to me all at once, not with panic, but with a slow, heavy clarity that settled in my chest. This was my room now. This narrow bed. This quiet, sterile space that did not carry a single memory of my life before yesterday. I sat up slowly, my joints stiff from a restless night, and looked around again as if something might have changed while I slept. It had not. My suitcase sat neatly by the dresser, still half unpacked, as though even I had not fully accepted that I was meant to stay. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. No missed calls. No messages. I waited a few seconds, just in case the screen might light up on its own. It did not. I placed it back down carefully, as if it were something fragile, something that might break under the weight of disappointment. The hallway outside was already alive with movement when I opened my door. Slow footsteps. Quiet conversations. The occasional laugh that felt out of place, like it belonged to another life entirely. I followed the signs toward the dining hall, moving at the same measured pace as everyone else, blending into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. Breakfast was served on white trays, each plate arranged with the same careful precision. Scrambled eggs, toast, a small cup of fruit. I sat at a table near the window, watching as other residents spoke in low voices or ate in silence. Some stared ahead as if waiting for something. Others seemed to have stopped waiting altogether. A woman across from me smiled politely and asked how long I had been here. Since yesterday, I replied. She nodded, as if that explained everything, and returned to her meal without another word. After breakfast, I wandered back toward my room, passing a small office with the door slightly open. Inside, I could hear a conversation between two staff members, their voices low but not low enough. She is already set up for a long-term stay, one of them said. All payments arranged in advance. The other responded with a quiet hum of acknowledgement. Family must have planned ahead. I slowed my steps, just enough to catch those words clearly before, continuing down the hall as if I had heard nothing at all. Long-term, not temporary, not short. The words settled into place with a calm certainty that surprised me. I did not feel shocked. I did not feel angry. I felt something else. Confirmation. Back in my room, I closed the door gently and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap. I replayed Daniel's voice in my mind, the careful way he had chosen his words, the softness that now felt rehearsed. I thought of Rebecca, her quiet confidence, the way she had never once looked at me as if I were part of the decision. And then I thought of the house. My house. The one I had lived in for over 30 years. The one filled with photographs, with furniture chosen over decades, with a garden I had tended every spring without fail. A thought crossed my mind, quiet but insistent. If they had planned this for so long, what else had they already decided without me? I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the same parking lot, the same empty spaces where cars came and went without meaning. Somewhere beyond that view was my life as I knew it, continuing without me, adjusting, rearranging, making room for my absence. I pressed my fingertips lightly against the glass and allowed myself a single, steady breath. They believed I would not question it. They believed I would accept what they told me, and nothing more. And for years, I had done exactly that. I had trusted. I had signed where they pointed. I had believed that being a good mother meant stepping aside when asked. But something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for me to see that this place was not the beginning of the end. It was the moment everything started to make sense. And if everything had been arranged so carefully, then somewhere in that arrangement, there would be something they had overlooked. I did not rush that morning, and I did not pretend to adjust. Instead, I began to pay attention. That was something I had not done in a long time, not in the way I should have. For years, I had trusted what I was told. I had accepted explanations, small reassurances, convenient answers that kept everything peaceful. But now, with nothing left to maintain and no role left to perform, I finally had the space to observe. The details were everywhere once I allowed myself to see them. The way the staff greeted me by name, not with familiarity, but with the certainty of someone who had read it on a file. The way they spoke about my schedule as if it had already been decided weeks ago. The way my medications, my meals, even my weekly activities were all arranged before I had ever stepped into this building. It was efficient. Too efficient. Later that afternoon, a nurse came by with a clipboard and a warm smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "We just need to confirm a few details, Margaret," she said gently. "Your care plan, your preferences, your long-term arrangements." I looked at her, then at the paper in her hands. "Long-term," I repeated, my voice calm, steady. She paused for just a second, just long enough for the truth to show through before she corrected herself. Standard phrasing, she said quickly. It does not necessarily mean permanent. I nodded as if I accepted that explanation, but I did not look away. I let the silence sit there for a moment longer than she expected. She shifted slightly, then continued reading from the form, her voice returning to its practiced rhythm. I signed where she pointed, just as I had done before. But this time, I read every word. That evening, I asked to use the small computer station in the common area. The receptionist hesitated for a moment, then nodded and pointed me toward a quiet corner. I sat down slowly, adjusting my glasses, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as if I had forgotten how to begin. Then I typed my home address into the search bar. The screen loaded in a matter of seconds, and there it was. A listing. My house. My kitchen, the one I had remodeled 10 years ago, photographed from an angle that made it look brighter than it ever did in the early morning. The living room with the cream-colored sofa I had picked out with Daniel after his father passed. The garden in full bloom, captured on a day I knew I had not been there to see. Recently listed, the page said. Move and ready. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk. No rush. No panic. Just confirmation. They had not waited. They had not hesitated. By the time I had signed those papers, everything else had already been set in motion. I closed the page and sat there for a moment, watching the reflection of the screen fade back into darkness. Around me, the room carried on as usual. A television played softly in the background. Someone laughed at something I did not hear. A nurse walked past without noticing me. Life continued, just not mine. When I returned to my room, I did not turn on the light right away. I stood in the doorway, letting the quiet settle in, letting the shape of this place become familiar in a different way. Not as a place I had been sent to, but as a place I could use. I sat down on the bed and folded my hands together, just like I had the night they told me this was for my own good. Only now, the meaning was different. They believed they had moved quickly enough that I would not catch up, that I would not question the timeline, that I would not notice how everything had been arranged before I even knew there was a plan. But timing works both ways. If they had already made their moves, then all I had to do was understand them, piece by piece. Detail by detail, because people who believe they have finished something tend to stop being careful. And that is when they begin to reveal everything. It was not the first time I had felt something was off, only the first time I allowed myself to follow that feeling all the way to its conclusion. Sitting there in that quiet room, I began to trace everything backward, not in a rush, but slowly, carefully, like turning over pieces of a puzzle I had once ignored. It started with small things that had seemed harmless at the time. Daniel calling less often, always busy, always distracted. Conversations that used to last an hour reduced to a few polite minutes. Rebecca stepping in more frequently, answering questions for him, making decisions that did not seem like hers to make. I had told myself it was normal, that people grow, that families change, that I should not interfere. I remember the first time Daniel mentioned simplifying things. We were sitting in the living room, late afternoon sunlight coming through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor I had polished just the week before. He had spoken gently, almost carefully, suggesting that it might be easier if some of the accounts were consolidated, if paperwork was streamlined. Just to make things easier for you, Mom, he had said, his tone reassuring, patient. I had smiled, grateful that he was thinking ahead, grateful that he cared enough to help. I signed a few documents that day. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that felt final. Just adjustments. Small changes. That was how it began. After that, there were more conversations. Always reasonable. Always framed as something that would benefit me. A power of attorney, just in case. Access to accounts, just for convenience. Rebecca would sit quietly nearby, occasionally adding a suggestion, always presented as helpful, always delivered with that same calm confidence that made everything sound sensible. I never questioned it. Why would I? They were my family. I had spent my entire life trusting them. And then there were the visits. At first, they came regularly. Sunday afternoons, just like always. We would sit at the kitchen table, drink coffee, talk about work, about plans, about nothing in particular. But gradually, those visits became less predictable, then less frequent, then replaced with quick drop-ins that felt more like obligations than moments shared. We have been so busy, Rebecca would say with a polite smile. Things have just been hectic. I would nod, understanding, not wanting to be the reason they felt guilty. I see it clearly now, how each step was so small it barely registered. How each decision was framed as care, as support, as love. How I participated in my own removal without ever realizing it. The memory that stayed with me the most came from just a few weeks ago. Daniel had stood in my kitchen, leaning against the counter, looking around as if he were seeing it differently. "This house is a lot to manage," he said casually. "Have you ever thought about something smaller? Something easier?" I laughed it off at the time, telling him I had managed just fine for over 30 years. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Rebecca had not said anything. She had just watched, observing, measuring. That was the moment I should have understood, not because of what he said, but because of how it felt, like a suggestion that had already been decided. Now, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in a place that was never meant to feel like home, I could see the full picture. Every conversation, every document, every subtle shift had led here. Not by accident, not by necessity, but by design. I was not moved because I needed care. I was moved because I was in the way. I let that truth settle in without resistance. No anger, no denial, just clarity. Because once you understand something completely, it stops having power over you. And for the first time in a long time, I was not looking at them as my family. I was looking at them as people who had made a series of choices. Careful choices. Strategic choices. And if they had taken the time to plan every step that led me here, then I could take the time to understand every step that would lead me out. The next morning, I did not go to breakfast right away. Instead, I sat by the window and waited, not for something to happen, but for something to reveal itself. There is a difference. When you wait for something, you expect it. When you observe, you notice what others overlook. Around 9 o'clock, there was a soft knock on my door. Not the quick, routine knock of a nurse, but something more deliberate. I opened it to find a man standing in the hallway, well dressed in a way that did not quite match the rest of this place. His suit was simple but tailored, his posture straight, his expression careful. "Mrs. Collins?" he asked. I studied his face for a moment before answering. "Yes." He offered a small, respectful nod. "My name is Thomas Henderson. I handled your late husband's legal affairs." The name settled into my memory slowly, like something I had not needed to recall until now. Then it clicked. My husband's attorney. The man who had sat across from us years ago, explaining documents in a calm, measured voice while my husband asked questions I did not always understand. "May I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside without hesitation. Once inside, he did not sit immediately. He glanced around the room briefly, taking in the narrow bed, the small dresser, the absence of anything personal. Then he turned back to me. "I apologize for coming unannounced," he said. "But I was not aware of your current living situation until recently." I offered a faint smile. "It seems there are a few things people were not aware of." That was enough. He understood. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder, placing it carefully on the small table by the window. "Your husband made several provisions before he passed," he said. Most of them were straightforward. But there was one addition he insisted on including, something he asked me to keep separate unless certain conditions were met. I felt my hand still in my lap, but my attention sharpened. "What kind of conditions?" I asked. He met my eyes directly, his voice steady. "If you were ever placed under long-term care without your explicit consent, or if there were signs that your assets were being transferred or managed without your full awareness." The room seemed quieter after that, as if even the building itself had paused to listen. I did not speak right away. I simply nodded once, slowly. "Then I suppose those conditions have been met," I said. He opened the folder and slid a document toward me. "Your husband anticipated the possibility of external influence," he continued. "He created a secondary legal structure that overrides any transfers made under questionable circumstances, including property sales and financial control granted through power of attorney." I looked down at the document, my name printed clearly across the top, followed by language that was precise, deliberate, and unmistakable. Protection, safeguards, reversal clauses. I did not need to read every line to understand what it meant. My husband had seen something I had not, or perhaps he had simply been more cautious. Either way, he had left something behind. Not just for me, but for a moment like this. "Does Daniel know about this?" I asked quietly. Henderson shook his head. "No, he would not. Your husband was very specific about that." I let out a slow breath, not of relief, but of recognition. This was the piece they had not accounted for, the detail they had overlooked, the one thing they could not control because they did not know it existed. I closed the folder gently, resting my hand on top of it. What happens now? I asked. Henderson's expression did not change, but there was something firmer in his tone. That depends on you, Mrs. Collins. We can act immediately, or we can wait. Sometimes, allowing people to continue believing they are in control reveals far more than confronting them too soon. I nodded again, this time with intention. For the first time since I arrived here, I felt something shift completely into place. Not hope, not anger, something steadier, something precise. Then we wait, I said calmly. Let them finish what they started. Henderson closed his briefcase and gave a slight nod of approval. Very well, he replied. After he left, I remained seated by the window, the folder resting quietly in front of me. Outside, the parking lot looked the same as it had the day before. Ordinary, unremarkable. But inside, everything had changed. Because now, I was no longer trying to understand what had happened to me. I was beginning to understand what they had done. And more importantly, what they had not done carefully enough. After Henderson left, I did not open the folder again right away. I let it sit there on the table, closed, quiet, almost ordinary. There was no urgency now. That was the difference. Before, everything had happened to me without pause, without explanation, without space to think. Now I had time. And time, I realized, was something they no longer had control over. I followed the same routine the next day. Breakfast at the same table. The same tray. The same quiet conversations around me. I nodded when spoken to, smiled when expected, moved at the same steady pace as everyone else. Nothing about me suggested anything had changed. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Later that morning, I asked the front desk if I could make a phone call. The receptionist handed me the phone without question. I dialed Daniel's number slowly, listening to each tone as it rang. He answered on the fourth ring. Mom. His voice carried a hint of surprise, but not concern. Not warmth. Just surprise. Hi, Daniel, I said calmly. I just wanted to check in. There was a brief pause on the line, the kind that fills with unspoken calculations. Everything okay? He asked. I smiled slightly, even though he could not see it. Of course. Everyone here has been very kind. I think I am settling in. I let my voice soften just enough, the way I had learned to do over the years, the way that always reassured him. That is good, he replied, and I could hear the relief in his tone, subtle but unmistakable. We were hoping you would adjust quickly. I noted the word but did not react. I was also thinking, I continued gently. Maybe you were right about simplifying things. The house, the accounts, it might be easier if everything was finalized sooner rather than later. Silence again. Longer this time. Then, carefully, what do you mean? I leaned back slightly, keeping my voice even. Just that if there are any documents left, anything that needs my signature, you can bring them by. I do not want to complicate things for you. The shift on the other end of the line was immediate. Subtle, but there. The tension replaced by something else. Something lighter. That actually might be helpful, Daniel said slowly. There are a few things we were still organizing. Of course there were. Then bring them, I said simply. I will be here. After I hung up, I sat for a moment, holding the receiver in my hand, feeling the quiet settle back into place. He believed me, not because I was convincing, but because I was predictable. Because for years, I had responded exactly this way. Agreeable, cooperative, trusting. That was the version of me they understood. The version they relied on. I placed the phone back on the counter and returned to my room without drawing attention. Once inside, I closed the door gently and walked to the table where the folder still rested. This time, I opened it. I read every line slowly, carefully, not rushing, not skipping. Each clause was precise, each condition clearly defined. Any transfer of property without full disclosure could be reversed. Any misuse of authority could be challenged. Any action taken under false representation could be nullified. It was not just protection. It was a safeguard designed for exactly this kind of situation. I closed the folder again and rested my hand on top of it, feeling the weight of it, not physically, but in what it represented. They thought they were finishing something, closing a chapter, moving forward without interruption. But what they did not realize was that they had only reached the part where everything becomes visible, where every assumption begins to unravel. And now, all I had to do was let them continue, Just a little longer, just enough for them to show me exactly how far they were willing to go. They arrived 2 days later, just as I expected they would. Not too soon, not too late. Just enough time to make it seem reasonable. Daniel walked in first, holding a leather folder under his arm, his expression carefully neutral. Rebecca followed a step behind, her posture straight, her eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on me. She smiled, but it was the same smile she had worn the day they left me here. Polite, controlled, distant. "Mom," Daniel said, stepping forward as if nothing had changed. "You look settled." I returned the smile with one of my own, softer, quieter. "I am," I replied. "It is different, but I am adjusting." I gestured toward the small table by the window. "You can put the papers there." He did not hesitate. That told me everything I needed to know. The folder opened quickly, efficiently, as if he had gone through it several times already. Rebecca remained standing, her hands loosely clasped in front of her, watching, always watching. "There are just a few final documents," Daniel said, sliding the first one toward me. "Some confirmations. Nothing complicated." I picked up the paper and read it slowly. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted them to see me do it. Line by line, word by word. I asked a question here and there, small ones, simple ones. This account transfer, is this permanent? This property clause, does this include the full sale? Daniel answered each question patiently, his tone calm, almost reassuring. Rebecca added occasional clarifications, always precise, always ready. They had prepared for this. They expected compliance, but they had also prepared explanations just in case. I nodded after each answer, letting my expression remain thoughtful, cooperative. Then I signed. One document, then another. My hands steady, my movements unhurried. I did not rush. I did not resist. I became exactly what they believed I was. Predictable. Agreeable. Finished. When I placed the pen down after the last signature, Daniel let out a breath he had been holding without realizing it. Rebecca's shoulders relaxed, just slightly. A shift so small, it would have been invisible to anyone. Not looking for it. But I was looking. I stood up slowly, walking over to the small dresser as if I were searching for something. "I am glad we could take care of this," I said lightly. "I would not want to make things difficult for you." "You never do," Rebecca replied smoothly, her voice carrying a note of approval that felt more like confirmation than gratitude. I turned back to them, meeting her eyes for just a moment longer than necessary. Then I smiled again, gentle, calm. "That is what family does," I said. They stayed only a few minutes after that. There was no reason to linger. Everything they had come for was complete. Or so they believed. Daniel gave me another brief hug before they left, the same kind as before, quick and careful. "We will check in soon," he said. I nodded. "Take your time." I stood by the window as they walked back to the car, watching the familiar pattern repeat itself. Doors opening, doors closing, the engine starting. No hesitation, no second look, just movement forward. When their car disappeared from view, I did not move right away. I let the silence settle again, deeper this time, steadier. Then I walked back to the table and picked up the copies of what I had signed. I placed them beside the folder Henderson had given me, aligning them carefully. Side by side. Action and consequence. Assumption and reality. They believed they had secured everything. That each signature had closed another door behind me. That I no longer had anything left to question, to challenge, to reclaim. But signatures do not always mean what people think they do. Not when the foundation they rely on is already compromised. I sat down slowly, resting my hands on the table, looking at the papers without urgency. Because now, there was no need to rush. They had shown me everything I needed to see. And more importantly, they had done exactly what I needed them to do. The meeting was set for the following week, not at the nursing home, but at Henderson's office downtown. Daniel agreed without hesitation when I suggested it, which told me more than his words ever could. He believed this was the final step, the moment everything would be completed cleanly and without resistance. Rebecca insisted on coming, of course. She always did when something important was involved. The morning of the meeting, I dressed more carefully than I had since arriving here. A simple navy dress, the one I used to wear for family dinners, paired with the pearl necklace my husband had given me years ago. Nothing extravagant, just familiar, just enough to remind myself of who I had been before all of this. Henderson greeted me first when I arrived, his expression calm, steady, as if nothing about this situation surprised him anymore. Everything is ready, he said quietly. I nodded once. Good. Daniel and Rebecca arrived a few minutes later, both dressed in the same polished way they always presented themselves to the world. Controlled, composed, confident. Mom, Daniel said as he approached, offering that same practiced smile. I'm glad you agreed to do this here. It will make everything official. I returned the smile, just as measured. Yes, I said. Official. We sat down around the conference table, the documents already arranged neatly in front of each seat. Henderson remained at the head of the table, his hands folded, observing more than speaking. Daniel began to explain the paperwork again, though this time his tone carried a quiet sense of completion, as if he were walking through a process he already considered finished. Rebecca added details where needed, her voice precise, controlled, confident in every word. I listened without interrupting, letting them move through each point exactly as they intended. When Daniel finally reached the end, he looked at me expectantly. Once these are finalized, everything will be settled, he said. There will be no loose ends. I nodded slowly, letting a brief silence settle over the room. Then I looked down at the documents in front of me, placing my hand lightly on top of them. You are right, I said calmly. There will be no loose ends. Henderson shifted slightly, just enough to signal the transition. He reached for a separate folder, the one he had brought specifically for this moment, and placed it in front of me before sliding copies toward Daniel and Rebecca. Before we proceed, he said evenly, there is an additional document that must be reviewed. Rebecca's expression did not change immediately, but I saw it in her eyes. A flicker. A calculation. What document? She asked. Henderson opened the folder and turned it toward them. A contingency provision established by Mr. Collins prior to his passing, he explained. It outlines specific conditions under which previously signed agreements may be reviewed, challenged, or reversed. Daniel frowned slightly, confusion beginning to replace his certainty. Reversed, he repeated. Henderson nodded. In cases where it is determined that decisions were made without full disclosure, or under circumstances that may not reflect the best interests of the original owner. The room grew quieter. Not tense, just still. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her composure holding, but tighter now. I do not understand how that applies here, she said. I lifted my gaze and met hers directly. You will, I replied, my voice steady, almost gentle. Henderson continued, outlining each clause with the same measured precision he had used years ago, only now the words carried a different weight. Asset transfer subject to review. Property sales pending validation. Authority granted under power of attorney requiring confirmation of intent. Each sentence built on the last, forming something neither of them had prepared for. Daniel's posture shifted, his confidence thinning as realization began to take shape. Rebecca remained still, but her silence had changed. It was no longer controlled. It was careful. When Henderson finished, he closed the folder and folded his hands once more. Based on the conditions outlined here, he said, we will need to pause all current transfers until a full review is completed. No raised voices. No confrontation. Just a simple statement. I rested my hands in my lap, watching them absorb what had just been placed in front of them. Not reacting. Not explaining. Just allowing the moment to settle. Because this was not about proving anything. It was about revealing what had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And now, there was nothing left for them to assume. I did not speak immediately after Henderson finished. I did not need to. The silence in the room carried more weight than anything I could have said. Daniel looked down at the documents again, then back at Henderson, then finally at me, as if searching for something familiar that was no longer there. Mom, he said carefully, his voice lower now, less certain. We were just trying to help you. This was supposed to make things easier. I held his gaze without reacting, without softening. Easier for who? I asked quietly. The question did not need emphasis. It settled between us. Exactly as it was. Rebecca straightened slightly in her chair, her composure returning in small, deliberate movements. There must be some misunderstanding, she said, her tone controlled but tighter than before. Everything we have done has been within legal boundaries. Henderson did not respond right away. He simply opened the folder again and turned one of the pages toward them. Legal boundaries depend on full disclosure and informed consent, he said evenly, both of which will now be reviewed. Rebecca's expression did not break, but the certainty behind it shifted. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand slowly across his face, as if trying to catch up to something that had already passed him. I watched them both for a moment, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a clarity I had not felt in years. Then I spoke again, my voice steady, almost calm. You planned everything very carefully, I said. The conversations, the paperwork, the timing. You made sure I would not question it. You made sure I would trust you. Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Rebecca remained still, her eyes fixed on the documents in front of her. And I continued. For a long time, I did exactly what you expected. I let that sit there for a moment, not as an accusation, but as a fact. But you forgot something. Daniel looked up at me then, his expression uncertain. What? I met his eyes directly. You forgot that I was there when everything you have now was built. Every account, every decision, every step. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. You thought moving me out would remove me from it. But it did not. Henderson closed the folder once more, the sound quiet but final. All current transfers are suspended, he said. A full review will begin immediately. No one argued. There was nothing to argue with. The process had already shifted beyond their control. The meeting ended shortly after that, not with confrontation, but with a quiet understanding that nothing would proceed the way they had planned. Daniel stood first, slower than before, his movements less certain. We will figure this out, he said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. I nodded once. Yes, I replied. You will. Rebecca gathered her things without. Looking at me, her movements precise, controlled, but no longer effortless. For the first time, there was weight behind them. They left the office together, just as they had arrived, but something between them had changed. Not broken. Not yet. Just exposed. Henderson remained behind, watching the door close before turning back to me. Would you like to return to your home? He asked quietly. I considered the question for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood what it meant now. Then I shook my head slightly. Not yet, I said. There are still things that need to be finished properly. He nodded in understanding. When I stepped outside the building, the air felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just clear. I stood there for a moment, looking out at the street, the movement of people, the ordinary rhythm of a day that had nothing to do with what had just happened inside. For the first time since all of this began, I was not reacting. I was deciding. They thought they had placed me somewhere I would disappear. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere final. But they had only given me distance. And distance has a way of revealing everything. I adjusted my coat, took a steady breath, and stepped forward, not as someone returning to what was taken, but as someone who finally understood exactly what was hers to begin with.